I found messages from my mother offering $5,000 to my 14-year-old son to testify that I abused him. He recorded everything and showed me while crying. My 14-year-old adolescent son showed me a video recording captured on his cell phone, with silent tears freely streaming down his face, while my own mother explicitly offered 5,000 Rs in cash notes for him to deliberately lie at the police station, saying that I physically abused him, leaving visible marks on his developing adolescent body. And at that exact moment, I deeply realized that I had crossed an irreversible, invisible line in a family war, where someone was completely willing to sacrifice the entire psychological integrity of a vulnerable child in formation to destroy my established professional and personal reputation through extremely serious false criminal accusations that would irreversibly prevent me from continuing to work as a professional psychologist if they were believed by the official authorities of the criminal justice system. The reality of that rainy Thursday night when Lucas came desperately running to my private office, where I was finishing a final session with an anxious client discussing her own complex family traumas, his face pale as white paper and red eyes swollen from uncontrollable compulsive crying, revealed that something had catastrophically exploded in his world, while I was professionally absorbed helping other people resolve their own emotional traumas and intense psychological crises, completely unaware that my own family was being systematically disintegrated through cruel and premeditated psychological manipulation executed by a person who should be in her senior years, peacefully enjoying the family relationships she had built throughout 65 years of existence instead of maliciously conspiring to destroy her adult daughter and psychically contaminate the teenage son who trusted her as an absolute familial figure of security and unwavering protection during these critical years of his emotional development. Lucas visibly and uncontrollably trembling while clutching the cell phone in his hands as if it were incandescent criminal evidence that could literally burn his skin if held for too long. His small, fragile, and broken voice while explaining with evident difficulty and broken breathing that he had received progressive WhatsApp messages from my mother, Marta, throughout that entire week, suggesting secret clandestine meetings where she needed to talk to him about very important things that I was supposedly hiding about my own private personal life that somehow directly affected him, even though no one could rationally explain exactly what this bizarre connection would be between my private professional matters and the urgent need for clandestine meetings between grandmother and grandson without any knowledge or informed consent of the biological mother legally responsible for his well-being. The progressive messages that Lucas showed me trembling and crying uncontrollably were a calculated progression and methodically planned, sophisticated emotional manipulation where my mother began by expressing false, generic, seemingly maternal concern about my general mental well-being and mainly systematically questioned if he thought I was being honest with him about absolutely everything happening in my private, personal, and professional life, then gradually escalated by suggesting with a conspiratorial tone of confidence that perhaps there were very serious important things he needed to know, but that nobody had apparent courage to tell him due to misguided paternalistic protection, and finally culminated in a premeditated, planned in-person conversation at the community park, where she had explicitly offered 5,000 Rs in cash notes for Lucas to record a video falsely testifying that I frequently physically abused him, leaving visible marks on his developing adolescent body, that I psychologically pressured him through constant, systematic, degrading insults, and mainly that I was shamelessly lying about my own mental health when saying I was emotionally well, when in fact I was supposedly experiencing severe, devastating psychotic disorder that made me extremely dangerous for him and the rest of the nuclear family that lived with me daily. The devastating combination of direct and specific monetary offer linked to very specific documented criminal false accusations, repeated emphasis on the critical importance of obtaining high-quality video recording that could supposedly be used in future legal proceedings against me formally at police stations, and mainly intense emotional pressure through paranoid narratives about my alleged mental illness that theoretically would justify urgent and immediate need to protect Lucas through formal criminal complaints, revealed a pattern so clearly calculated of family conspiracy that it was practically impossible to imagine someone deliberately orchestrating everything without meticulous prior planning, executed during weeks or possibly entire months of malicious reflection, while waiting for the strategically appropriate opportunity to implement the destructive scheme she had carefully conceived. When I finally managed to move beyond the paralyzing initial shock that froze my capacity for rational reaction during the terrifying first minutes of understanding what Lucas was revealing with tears in his eyes, the first visceral reaction was to desperately hug my teenage son, trying to communicate through reassuring physical contact that this situation was absolutely not his fault, that he had made the absolutely correct choice, showing me that incriminating evidence, instead of accepting the offered bribe and producing false criminal accusations against his mother who loved him unconditionally, and mainly that regardless of how much his grandmother had tried to psychically manipulate him through subtle threats about my supposed dangerousness and aggressiveness, his emotional and moral integrity had remained intact, demonstrating admirable character that I was tremendously proud of him, even in the midst of that impossible family nightmare that should be completely psychically destroying any normal teenager subjected to that kind of cruel, intensive, manipulative pressure. Lucas was crying uncontrollably while explaining in a voice broken by emotional sobs that he had recorded that entire in-person conversation with Marta on video, without her knowledge, absolutely, because some part of him instinctively knew that the situation was absolutely wrong, even if he couldn't fully articulate exactly why his grandmother would be offering real money for him to publicly lie about his mother at a police station in the presence of official authorities. And mainly because he possessed remarkable intelligent intuition developed through 14 whole years of living with me as his mother, where I had consistently modeled absolute honesty, true emotional integrity, and primarily created a family environment where open discussion about difficult feelings was genuinely encouraged instead of suppressed through the invalidating minimization that many parents unfortunately practice. The video itself was approximately 8 minutes and 30 seconds in duration, showing my mother Marta positioned on the wooden bench in the community park, with Lucas sitting beside her, while she alternated between seemingly genuine fake concern and poorly disguised frustration as he repeatedly refused to accept the attractive monetary offer and primarily refused to promise that he would record the false criminal accusations she had formally requested. At one disturbing moment in the video, my mother even maliciously suggested that perhaps Lucas was being deliberately manipulated by me to reject the grandmother's generous help, that I had probably psychologically poisoned the teenager against her through infamous false stories about her character, when in reality she was only trying to protect him against a dangerous mother who needed to be reported immediately to the official authorities before causing irreversible and permanent damage to his developing mental health. The disturbing psychological sophistication of Marta's manipulation was practically impressive in its malevolent strategic elegance, and mainly revealed deep systematic study of child coercion tactics found in contemporary literature on child abuse. She had transformed Lucas's clear rejection of her criminal bribe into supposedly probative evidence that he was being psychologically manipulated against her, completely inverting objective reality, where clearly it was she who was trying to manipulate a vulnerable and mentally unstable adolescent, instead of his mother, who was biologically responsible for his emotional and mainly moral well-being during these critical years of psychological development. This type of fundamentally dishonest reality distortion, where victims of manipulation became supposed perpetrators, while real manipulators falsely presented themselves as disinterested protectors, was such a perverse psychological tactic that it suggested my mother had systematically studied sophisticated emotional gaslighting techniques and deep psychological manipulation instead of organically developing them through normal dysfunctional coexistence found in families with typical harmful dynamics in contemporary society. In the hours immediately following that terrifying horror revealed through the video that Lucas had courageously captured on his portable cellular device, I simultaneously needed to process my own accumulated devastating emotional shock, incalculable deep psychological trauma, justified fury directed at my mother who had given me life during childbirth, and mainly emotionally support Lucas through an improvised acute crisis therapy session and genuine parental reassurance where I validated his deep confused feelings without forcing him to repeatedly discuss the most disturbing and traumatic aspects of what had happened in that community park, where he had been offered real money to commit serious crimes against his mother. As a professional psychologist with extensive years of practical clinical experience, I intuitively understood that Lucas needed to be formally treated as a legitimate victim of attempted serious criminal coercion, rather than a potential accomplice in his grandmother's criminal scheme. And mainly that his acute psychological trauma of having been placed in that impossible position of choosing between familial loyalty to his biological mother or behavioral obedience to a family authority figure represented by his grandmother needed careful specialized processing through appropriate ongoing therapy, instead of repetitive interrogation about incriminating details that would simply painfully and unnecessarily relive the traumatic experience during subsequent weeks. Paulo arrived home approximately 45 minutes after the desperate call I made from the office, while still holding Lucas in my arms, trying to calm the uncontrollable tremors that shook his adolescent body like seismic waves traversing a fragile structure. His facial expression when he crossed the main door revealed a complex mixture of genuine paternal concern and deep confusion about the exact nature of the family emergency that had interrupted an important meeting with partners at the law firm. When I showed the video secretly recorded by Lucas documenting the explicit offer of criminal bribery made by my mother Marta in the community park just hours earlier, I watched the gradual transformation in Paulo's facial expression that began with absolute disbelief evidenced through deeply furrowed eyebrows, then evolved into genuine shock when he recognized Marta's unmistakable voice pronouncing specific monetary values directly linked to elaborately fabricated criminal accusations, and finally culminated in controlled fury. Paulo's initial reaction was extremely pragmatic and characteristically lawyerly as expected, considering decades of professional experience dealing with complex legal situations involving devastating family conflicts, immediately questioning technical details about the video's authenticity as potentially admissible evidence in future criminal proceedings, confirming that Lucas had recorded voluntarily without external coercion, and primarily meticulously verifying that digital timestamps embedded in the file metadata would chronologically correspond with other evidence. While Paulo methodically analyzed the technical legal aspects of the situation with a trained professional mind focused on building a solid legal case based on irrefutable documented evidence, I observed Lucas huddled on the living room sofa with knees pulled against his chest and arms wrapping around his legs in a self-protective defensive posture that clearly communicated an urgent need for emotional security and primarily genuine parental validation that completely transcended abstract legal discussions about evidentiary admissibility and potential procedural strategies. I interrupted Paulo's legal analysis with professional firmness manifested through a vocal tone that admitted no negotiation, explicitly declaring that the absolute immediate priority was Lucas's comprehensive emotional well-being rather than prematurely constructing an offensive legal strategy against my mother, and primarily that our teenage son fundamentally needed to be protected against repetitive traumatic revivification through detailed interrogations about the horrific experience he had courageously survived a few hours earlier when confronted with a maliciously fabricated, impossible moral dilemma. Paulo immediately agreed with my professional clinical assessment about Lucas's priority emotional needs, demonstrating admirable flexibility to instantly abandon rigorous lawyer mode and return to the comforting paternal role that our son desperately needed in that moment of devastating acute family crisis. Sitting close to Lucas on the sofa and wrapping a protective arm around the teenager's trembling shoulders while murmuring gentle verbal reassurances about family safety and unconditional love that completely transcended any conflicts. The messages had begun with seemingly casual, innocent questions about how Lucas was feeling emotionally regarding general family dynamics, and primarily whether he felt he could openly talk to me about absolutely anything that bothered him without fear of maternal judgment or negative repercussions, implicitly creating subtle doubt about the quality of mother-son communication through veiled suggestions that perhaps there were implicitly censored topics he didn't feel comfortable discussing. Subsequently, the messages gradually escalated, introducing vague insinuations about my supposed recent erratic behavior that Marta claimed to have observed during family visits, conspiratorially suggesting that perhaps Lucas had also noticed worrying changes in my mood or emotional stability, but was hesitant to mention it out of misguided filial loyalty, systematically constructing a false narrative about the progressive deterioration of my mental health that would supposedly justify urgent external intervention to protect the family against imaginary dangers. The crucial turning point in the manipulative sequence of messages had occurred when Marta explicitly requested a private in-person meeting with Lucas without my knowledge or informed consent, justifying secrecy through absurd allegations that I would supposedly react with disproportionate aggression or emotional retaliation against Lucas if I discovered he was confidentially talking with grandmother about legitimate family concerns, perversely transforming my supposed hypothetical imaginary defensive reaction into retroactive evidence that would prove a false narrative about instability. Lucas admitted with a small voice laden with unjustified self-directed guilt that he had initially agreed to secretly meet Marta at the park because he genuinely believed that grandmother was legitimately concerned about collective family well-being, and mainly because adolescents frequently experience normal developmental impulses toward autonomy that make them susceptible to invitations from trusted adults offering to treat them as mature confidants capable of handling complex adult information that is supposedly hidden from them by excessive parents. I repeatedly reassured Lucas with loving maternal firmness that absolutely no part of that catastrophic situation was remotely his fault, that Marta had employed sophisticated psychological manipulation tactics specifically designed to exploit normal developmental vulnerabilities of adolescents and especially their legitimate needs to be treated with respect and trust by significant adult figures, and that his demonstration of fundamental moral integrity by recording incriminating evidence and subsequently revealing everything to me represented a triumph of character over coercion rather than behavioral failure. Paulo contributed to parental reassurances by explicitly declaring with paternal authority that Lucas had acted with extraordinary courage facing intense manipulative pressure from a family authority figure, and especially making the morally correct choice, even when it would have been infinitely easier to simply accept the offered money and record false accusations as requested, emphasizing that many fully developed adults with decades of life experience would fail that same ethical test when confronted with the tempting combination of financial reward and emotional pressure. In the subsequent hours, as Lucas finally fell asleep emotionally exhausted on the sofa covered with a cozy blanket, Paulo and I retreated to the kitchen illuminated only by dim light above the stove to discuss appropriate responsive strategies, considering the extreme gravity of the criminal actions perpetrated by my mother against our vulnerable adolescent son, and especially against the complete integrity of our family structure that we had carefully built during 14 years of marriage and parenthood. Paulo initially argued with characteristic lawyer logic that we should immediately go to the police station the following morning to file a formal criminal complaint against Marta for attempted coercion of a minor, corruption of a potential witness, and conspiracy to produce false criminal accusations against me, presenting the recorded video as irrefutable documentary evidence that would clearly establish her criminal culpability beyond any reasonable doubt that public prosecutors would require to proceed with charges. My initial instinctive reaction was deep emotional resistance against the idea of criminally reporting my own biological mother to state authorities, even rationally recognizing that her actions objectively constituted serious crimes and especially represented a continued threat to Lucas's emotional security, if not decisively confronted through formal legal consequences that would establish unbreakable boundaries protecting our family against future manipulations, creating a devastating internal conflict between protective maternal obligations and deeply filial loyalties. Paulo validly recognized the emotional complexity of my position through genuine conjugal empathy developed over years of intimate cohabitation, but firmly insisted that the gravity of Marta's actions completely transcended sentimental considerations about biological family bonds, and especially that failure to establish appropriate legal consequences would implicitly communicate to Lucas that adults in positions of family authority can perpetrate serious psychological abuses against vulnerable children without facing adequate accountability, fundamentally undermining ethical lessons about integrity. I emotionally argued that involving the criminal justice system would inevitably transform a private family situation into a potentially humiliating public spectacle, where intimate details of our relational dysfunctions would be exposed for scrutiny by strangers, including police officers, prosecutors, possibly judges, and especially local media, if the case generated journalistic interest due to the bizarre nature of a grandmother trying to bribe her teenage grandson to falsely accuse his psychologist mother of child abuse, creating immeasurable collateral damage to my professional reputation primarily. Paulo pragmatically responded that my concern about professional reputation, although humanly understandable, was precisely the type of psychological vulnerability that Marta had calculated to exploit through her scheme, correctly betting that my fear of public exposure and especially professional damage would make me hesitant to seek adequate legal protection, even when confronted with explicit criminal threats against my son's well-being, effectively allowing her to continue perpetrating manipulative abuses without consequences, because victims would be paralyzed. The discussion continued circling between Paulo's pragmatic legal perspectives, emphasizing the need to establish protective precedents through formal consequences, and my complex emotional resistances rooted in decades of family conditioning that made it almost impossible to conceptualize criminally reporting my own mother to state authorities, despite intellectually recognizing that she had committed serious crimes objectively against my vulnerable teenage son, who deserved absolute parental protection against all threats, including those originated. Eventually, we reached a temporary compromise where we agreed to professionally consult with an attorney specialized in family law and crimes against minors the following morning to obtain technical legal guidance about available options and especially strategic implications of different possible courses of action before making a final, irreversible decision about whether we would file a formal criminal complaint against Marta, or seek resolution through alternative channels, such as supervised family mediation or restraining orders. Paulo also prudently suggested that we should meticulously document all aspects of the incident, including making multiple backups of the recorded video in different secure digital storage locations, creating a detailed timeline of all WhatsApp messages exchanged between Marta and Lucas during the week prior to the park meeting, and especially scheduling a professional psychological evaluation for Lucas, with a child therapist specialized in trauma, to establish a formal clinical record of the emotional impact caused. I completely agreed with all these pragmatic documentary measures, recognizing that regardless of whether we eventually decided to proceed with a formal criminal complaint or not, careful preservation of all available evidence would be essential to protect our family against possible manipulative counterattacks from Marta, who might try to invert the narrative and falsely present herself as a victim of malicious family alienation, perpetrated by her supposedly mentally unstable daughter, as she had suggested to Lucas. The terrifying possibility that Marta could retaliate against our defensive response by launching her own false accusations against me to child protection authorities, alleging that I was psychologically abusing Lucas through parental alienation against a loving grandmother, represented a Kafkaesque nightmare where victims of manipulation would be perversely transformed into perpetrators through complete inversion of the documented objective reality, requiring meticulous preparation to defend against false narratives. I slept only intermittently that night while my mind tirelessly processed the complete devastating implications of the family betrayal perpetrated by my mother, alternating between periods of justified fury, where I fantasized about directly confronting her about the monstrosity of her actions, and episodes of deep sadness, mourning the irreversible loss of a mother-daughter relationship that I had naively imagined could eventually be repaired through dedicated therapeutic work, despite decades of dysfunctional patterns that I now recognized. Lucas also slept restlessly, as evidenced by sounds of frequent movements in his room and occasionally distressed murmurs suggesting nightmares processing recent trauma, confirming urgent need for specialized professional therapeutic support to help him process the experience of being criminally coerced by a trusted family figure, and mainly navigate inevitable confused feelings about future relationship with a grandmother who had demonstrated willingness to completely sacrifice his emotional well-being. The following morning, Friday, while preparing strong coffee, trying to compensate for sleep deprivation through caffeine, and mainly trying to create an appearance of comforting domestic normality for Lucas when he came down for breakfast before school, I received a series of progressively more aggressive text messages from Marta on my personal cell phone, demonstrating that she had realized Lucas had revealed the secret meeting in the park, and mainly was entering calculated damage control mode. The initial messages pretended manipulative maternal concern, questioning why I hadn't answered her phone calls the night before, and expressing false anxiety about my emotional well-being, but quickly escalated to defensive accusations claiming that Lucas had completely misinterpreted an innocent conversation in the park, and mainly insinuating that I was psychologically manipulating my teenage son against her through malicious distortions of normal family interactions. The speed with which Marta pivoted from explicit offering of criminal bribery documented in irrefutable video to a posture of wronged victim accusing others of manipulation was simultaneously impressive in its brazen psychological audacity and deeply disturbing in its demonstration of total absence of personal accountability or recognition of the gravity of the actions perpetrated, confirming patterns of pathological personality characterized by fundamental inability to process guilt or genuine empathy. I showed the received messages to Paulo, who read with progressively more severe expression, before definitively declaring that Marta's behavior in the hours subsequent to the exposure of her criminal scheme completely eliminated any remaining ambiguity about the need to seek formal legal protection, convincingly arguing that her attempts to invert reality and victimize herself represented a dangerous escalation that could culminate in her effectively presenting false accusations against me if we didn't establish. We made a definitive joint decision that Friday morning that we would immediately consult a specialized attorney, and mainly that we would keep Lucas at home absent from school, to avoid any possibility of Marta trying to contact him directly on the school route, or during breaks when he would be vulnerable and separated from protective parental supervision. Recognizing that she had demonstrated clear willingness to manipulate a vulnerable adolescent, and therefore could not be trusted with unsupervised access, I personally called the school explaining that Lucas was experiencing a family emergency, and would need to be temporarily absent while the situation was resolved. Speaking vaguely with the secretary about personal matters requiring immediate attention, without revealing specific details about the nature of the crisis, but requesting that the school administration be formally alerted that only biological parents had authorization to remove Lucas from the premises, and mainly that the maternal grandmother specifically should not be permitted contact. The school secretary reacted with appropriate professional concern, noting the urgent tone in my voice, and immediately agreed to update student security records to reflect the requested access restrictions, also offering to contact educational counselor Professor Regina to discuss additional support the school could provide for Lucas during the period of family crisis, without invasively pressing for details that I clearly wasn't prepared to share. I thanked the school for their cooperation, internally recognizing that we would eventually probably need to involve teacher Regina more completely in the situation to ensure Lucas received appropriate educational support and mainly emotional well-being monitoring during school hours when separated from direct parental supervision, but at that moment prioritizing immediate protection against possible contact from Marta over complete transparency with the educational institution. Paolo managed to schedule an emergency appointment for that same Friday afternoon with Dr. Monica Silveira, a renowned criminal attorney specialized in cases involving crimes against minors and complex family abuse dynamics, briefly explaining by phone the urgent nature of the situation, and primarily emphasizing that we possessed video evidence documenting a criminal coercion attempt of a teenager by an adult family member, ensuring that the case's gravity justified interrupting her normal schedule. While waiting for the legal consultation scheduled for 3 p.m, I tried to keep Lucas comfortable and distracted at home through normalizing activities such as watching his favorite movies and preparing comforting meals, but I could clearly observe through his body language and facial expressions that the adolescent mind was continuously processing the recent traumatic event and mainly struggling with confused feelings about how his relationship with his grandmother had been revealed as fundamentally. Lucas eventually broke the contemplative silence in mid-morning, asking hesitantly with a small, vulnerable voice if Grandma Marta would be sent to jail for having offered him money to lie about me at the police station, revealing complex concerns where even after being victimized by her cruel manipulation, he still experienced residual family loyalty and mainly anxiety about being responsible for serious legal consequences for a family member he had known throughout his entire life as a supposedly. The consultation with Dr. Monica that afternoon was simultaneously enlightening about the technical legal aspects of the situation, and emotionally devastating through objective professional confirmation that my mother had effectively committed serious crimes that could result in imprisonment if formally reported and criminally prosecuted, transforming a painful family situation into a formal legal crisis with potential permanent consequences that would irreversibly alter relationships. Dr. Monica Silveira received us punctually in her office, located on the 12th floor of a modern corporate building in the city's financial center. Her meeting room professionally decorated with framed legal diplomas and shelves filled with legal codes, conveying competent authority as she gestured for us to sit comfortably in leather armchairs, strategically positioned around a glass conference table where her laptop was already open, prepared to document. Paolo initiated a systematic chronological explanation of the events beginning with WhatsApp messages exchanged between Marta and Lucas during the week prior to the meeting at the community park, then detailing the explicit offer of 5,000 reais documented in the secretly recorded video, and finally describing Marta's subsequent attempts to invert the narrative through accusatory messages sent after discovering the scheme had been revealed, methodically presenting each element of evidence while Dr. Monica took detailed notes. When Paolo played the video recorded by Lucas showing Marta explicitly offering money linked to specific false accusations against me, Dr. Monica watched with a rigorously maintained, neutral professional expression during the first minutes, but gradually allowing her eyebrows to furrow as the full gravity of what she was witnessing penetrated her consciousness, occasionally pausing playback to request clarifications about temporal context or confirmation of authenticity of digital timestamps embedded in the metadata. After watching the complete video, followed by a thorough review of the previously exchanged WhatsApp messages, Dr. Monica leaned back in her executive chair while contemplatively interlacing her fingers and declared with professional authority grounded in decades of legal experience that the presented evidence clearly established the commission of multiple serious crimes including corruption of a minor, attempted witness coercion, conspiracy to produce false criminal accusations, and potentially even psychological child abuse depending on statutory interpretation. Dr. Monica, patiently but with appropriate professional candor, explained that we essentially had 3 strategic options available, considering the irrefutable documented evidence. The first option would be to immediately file a formal criminal complaint against Marta at the police station, allowing the criminal justice system to process the case through official channels, potentially resulting in formal charges, public trial, and possibly imprisonment if convicted. The second option would involve seeking a civil restraining order that would establish. The second option, as explained by Dr. Monica, would involve seeking a civil restraining order through family court that would establish legally binding limits, prohibiting Marta from contacting Lucas, or physically approaching him under penalty of imprisonment for judicial contempt, providing formal legal protection without necessarily initiating a complete criminal process that would transform a family situation into a potentially humiliating public spectacle through media coverage and accessible permanent court records. The third option presented was to attempt resolution through professionally supervised family mediation, where a trained neutral mediator would facilitate structured discussion between conflicting parties, allowing controlled communication about underlying issues while establishing binding agreements on acceptable future behaviors. But Dr. Monica frankly warned that mediation rarely worked effectively in cases involving severe psychological manipulation of minors, where the perpetrator demonstrated pathological personality characteristics, including absence of accountability. Dr. Monica observed the visible emotional conflict stamped on my face and intervened with gentle but firm professional empathy, stating that she completely understood the devastating emotional complexity of the situation, but that the absolute primary responsibility as Lucas's mother was to protect his psychological well-being against all threats, including those originating from biologically related family members, and primarily that allowing feelings of filial guilt to paralyze appropriate protective action would implicitly communicate to Lucas that loyalties. The attorney continued explaining with persuasive legal logic that failure to establish appropriate formal legal consequences for Marta's actions would not only leave Lucas vulnerable to potentially more elaborate future manipulations, as she refined tactics after realizing that the initial scheme had failed, but would also fundamentally undermine lessons about moral integrity and personal accountability that we were trying to teach our teenage son through parental modeling, creating dissonance between verbally professed values and behaviors. Paulo held my trembling hands while looking directly into my eyes with emotional intensity, rare for him, and declared with a voice loaded with absolute conviction that he deeply understood how much that decision was tearing me apart internally, but that in the end, Lucas was our unquestionable absolute priority, and that any course of action that left him vulnerable to future manipulation from Marta would be a fundamental betrayal of the parental responsibilities we had assumed when we decided to bring a vulnerable child into the world 14. I desperately argued through tears that began to flow freely down my face that perhaps a civil restraining order would provide adequate legal protection for Lucas without the need to transform my mother into a convicted criminal with a permanent record that would completely destroy any future possibility of a repaired relationship. But even as I verbalized the argument, I could hear the fundamental logical weakness in the rationalization that essentially prioritized preserving a relationship with a person who had demonstrated. Paulo responded with firm gentleness that a relationship worth preserving wouldn't be one where one of the parties actively tried to destroy another through an elaborate criminal conspiracy to produce false accusations of child abuse that would professionally prevent me from continuing to work as a psychologist, and primarily that any authentic future reconciliation would need to begin with Marta completely confronting the reality and consequences of the destructive choices she had deliberately made instead of being protected from the ramifications through. The devastating truth in Paulo's words penetrated psychological defenses that I had unconsciously built to protect myself against the need to fully face the reality of who my mother truly was fundamentally, instead of who I had desperately wished she would be during decades of dysfunctional relationship, characterized by repetitive cycles of emotional abuse, followed by brief periods of apparent normalcy that created false hope of permanent change that never genuinely materialized. When Dr. Monica returned to the conference room after a respectful 15-minute break, allowing for private emotional processing, I informed her with a trembling but determined voice that we had decided to proceed with a formal criminal complaint against Marta despite the personal emotional devastation this decision caused, requesting her guidance on specific necessary procedures, and especially the timeframes involved, to officially file a complaint at the police station while evidence remained recent and especially while Lucas was still available. Dr. Monica expressed professional approval of the decision, while simultaneously validly acknowledging the tremendous emotional difficulty it represented, explaining that she would personally accompany our family to the specialized police station for crimes against minors the following Saturday morning to file a formal complaint and provide legal support during the initial interview process with the responsible detective. and especially to ensure that Lucas's rights as a minor victim of attempted criminal coercion were appropriately protected. The lawyer also strongly recommended that we immediately schedule a complete professional psychological evaluation for Lucas, with a child therapist specialized in trauma, to establish formal clinical documentation of the emotional impact caused by Marta's manipulation attempt, explaining that an independent psychological assessment would conduct an objective analysis of Lucas's mental state and primarily provide expert testimony evidence if the case eventually went to criminal trial, where prosecutors would need to demonstrate psychological damages inflicted through the incident. The meeting continued for approximately another hour, while Dr. Monica meticulously reviewed procedures that would be followed during the filing of the criminal complaint at the police station, including types of questions the detective would likely ask, supplementary documentation we should bring besides the recorded video, and especially appropriate psychological preparation for Lucas, who would need to provide testimonial statements about his traumatic experience of being offered a bribe to criminally lie against his mother. When we finally left Dr. Monica's office at approximately 5:30 in the afternoon, the emotional and mental exhaustion accumulated over the past 24 hours had transformed into a tangible physical weight pressing down on our shoulders as we silently walked to the parking lot where we had left our car, each of us internally processing the magnitude of the decisions made and especially anxiously anticipating how events would unfold when we officially crossed the irreversible line by filing the complaint. Lucas had remained at home under the supervision of a trusted neighbor during the consultation with the lawyer as previously agreed, and when we returned, we found him distractedly watching television while pretending interest in a comedy program, but clearly absorbed in worried thoughts as evidenced by his distant expression and absence of reactions to jokes that would normally make him laugh spontaneously, confirming the urgent need for specialized therapeutic support to process the trauma. I sat next to Lucas on the sofa and carefully explained in age-appropriate language that we had consulted a specialized lawyer who confirmed that Grandma Marta had done very wrong things criminally when she offered him money to lie about me at the police station, and that tomorrow morning we would go together to talk to officers at the station to tell exactly what happened in the park, so authorities could decide what appropriate consequences should be. Lucas reacted with visible anxiety, asking hesitantly if he would have to watch Grandma being arrested in handcuffs and placed in a police car, revealing specific concerns that had likely been fed by dramatized representations of arrests in entertainment media that teenagers frequently consume, and especially demonstrating that despite having been victimized by her cruel manipulation, he still maintained inevitable residual emotional bonds, considering the 14-year family relationship. I reassured Lucas patiently that the criminal complaint process didn't work like it's represented in television shows, where people are immediately dramatically arrested the moment accusations are made, explaining that there would be a formal investigation conducted by a specialized detective that would include interviewing all involved parties and thoroughly reviewing evidence before any decision about filing formal charges or making an arrest, and especially that he would not be forced to witness anything that would upset him. Paolo contributed, explaining in a reassuring paternal tone that our responsibility as parents was to protect Lucas by ensuring that no one, including family members, could manipulate or coerce him without facing appropriate consequences, and especially that honestly telling the truth to authorities about what happened in the park wasn't betraying Grandma, but rather demonstrating admirable moral integrity by refusing to participate in a wrong scheme, even when the person offering it was someone he knew and trusted. I prepared Lucas's favorite comfort dinner that night, trying to create a sense of domestic normality amidst the emotional chaos while simultaneously internally processing the magnitude of the actions. We would take the following morning when we would officially transform a private family situation into a matter of public criminal justice involving state authorities and potentially the complete judicial system if the case proceeded through formal channels to an eventual criminal trial where my mother. Friday night was marked by distressing insomnia, where I remained awake for prolonged hours, obsessively reviewing decisions made and repeatedly questioning whether I was making the right choice by criminally reporting my own biological mother, or if I should have explored less confrontational alternatives, even rationally recognizing that Paolo's and Dr. Monica's arguments about the need to establish formal consequences to protect Lucas were logically sound and morally. Paolo also slept restlessly, as evidenced by frequent movements and occasional worried murmurs, confirming that despite his vocally confident defense of the need for criminal reporting during discussions, he was also internally struggling with the emotional weight of transforming a family conflict into a formal legal matter that would potentially result in his mother, in law, being arrested and criminally prosecuted through a justice system he professionally knew to be frequently merciless, and primarily. Lucas softly knocked on our bedroom door at approximately 2 in the morning, timidly asking if he could sleep in our room because he was having recurring nightmares about the confrontation in the park with Marta. And we naturally welcomed him immediately, allowing him to settle on an improvised mattress next to our bed, where he eventually fell asleep holding his hand while I remained awake, protectively observing his regular breathing and mainly processing maternal guilt. Saturday morning, we woke up early despite collective sleep deprivation because we had scheduled to meet Dr. Monica at the specialized police station for crimes against minors at 9 o'clock to file a formal complaint. And while preparing strong coffee and simple toast for breakfast, trying to create the appearance of normal routine, even though nobody really had an appetite considering the anticipated anxiety about what was to come, I received a new series of messages. The messages received from Marta that Saturday morning had dramatically escalated in aggressive tone compared to previous attempts at manipulative victimization, now explicitly threatening that if I persisted in supposedly poisoning Lucas against her through malicious lies about an innocent conversation in the park, she would be forced to take her own legal actions to protect her relationship with her grandson against my alienating interference, perversely inverting reality where she was the criminal manipulator documented on video into a narrative. I showed the threatening messages received to Paulo, who immediately forwarded screenshots to Dr. Monica via email, with an urgent note explaining that Marta was apparently preparing a legal counterattack, as we had discussed as a possibility during a previous consultation. And the lawyer quickly responded, instructing us to preserve all communications received as additional evidence of manipulative behavioral pattern, and mainly reassuring that filing a formal criminal complaint that morning would establish. We dressed Lucas in comfortable clothes appropriate for attendance at a police station while repeatedly explaining the process that would happen, including that a specialized officer would ask questions about what happened in the park, that he should answer honestly using his own words without trying to embellish or minimize events, and especially that we would be present throughout the interview providing emotional support and ensuring that his rights as a minor would be appropriately protected through representation. We arrived at the specialized police station approximately 15 minutes before the scheduled time, finding Dr. Monica already waiting at the main entrance, with an executive folder containing organized copies of all documentary evidence we had compiled, including video transferred to USB device, prints of exchanged WhatsApp messages, and most importantly, a detailed chronological summary of events meticulously prepared by the attorney, establishing complete context for the detective who would conduct. Detective Fernando received us in an interview room specially prepared for attending minor victims of crimes, an environment carefully designed to minimize institutional intimidation through comforting neutral decoration, including soft armchairs instead of typical hard police station chairs, gentle lighting instead of aggressive fluorescent lights, and most importantly, absence of threatening visual elements, such as exposed weapons or ostentatious police symbols that could amplify the natural anxiety of a vulnerable adolescent. The detective introduced himself with a deliberately gentle but professional vocal tone, explaining that his job was to investigate situations where minors may have been victims of crimes committed by adults, and especially that everything discussed in that room would be treated with absolute seriousness and appropriate confidentiality, respecting Lucas's rights as a minor witness, needing special protection under the Child and Adolescent Statute that establishes specific procedures for cases involving. Dr. Monica initiated formal presentation of the case, providing a concise but comprehensive summary of the events that had led our family to that police station, explaining the chronology of manipulative messages exchanged between Marta and Lucas during the week prior to the park meeting, detailing explicit offer of bribery linked to specific false criminal accusations, and most importantly, emphasizing that we possessed irrefutable video documentation, recorded by the minor himself, without the perpetrator's knowledge establishing evidence. Detective Fernando requested permission to play the video recorded by Lucas, and when images began being displayed on a monitor strategically positioned so we could all watch simultaneously, I observed the detective's facial expression gradually transform from professional neutrality to evident disapproval as he heard Marta explicitly offering money while specifying false accusations that Lucas should make against me at the police station, occasionally pausing playback to make detailed notes on a form. After watching the complete video, Detective Fernando directed attention to Lucas with a softened facial expression conveying appropriate empathy and asked with a gentle voice if he felt comfortable answering some questions about what had happened that day at the community park, carefully emphasizing that there were no right or wrong answers, and especially that he should feel completely free to say if any question made him uncomfortable or if he needed to take a break during the interview. Lucas hesitantly nodded his head while firmly holding my right hand and Paulo's hand with his left, seeking emotional anchoring through parental physical contact. His voice initially small and trembling, while confirming basic details about the date and location of the meeting with Marta, but gradually gaining stability as Detective Fernando demonstrated genuine patience, allowing the adolescent to completely process questions before answering without pressuring him to accelerate. The questions formulated by the detective were carefully structured to obtain necessary factual information, without revictimizing Lucas through insensitive interrogation, starting with establishing context about the historical relationship between him and grandmother to understand prior family dynamics. Then exploring progression of messages received during the previous week to document pattern of gradual manipulation, and finally focusing specifically on details of the in-person meeting at the park, including exact words used by Marta. When Detective Fernando directly asked how Lucas had felt when Marta offered money for him to lie about me at the police station, I observed my teenage son visibly struggle to articulate complex, conflicting emotions through facial expression that alternated between confusion, deep sadness, and especially devastating betrayal of having a trusted familial figure revealed as a manipulator willing to sacrifice his emotional well-being to achieve her own destructive objectives, confirming psychological damage inflicted through. Lucas explained in a broken voice that initially he had felt completely confused about why Grandma would be asking that, because he had always believed that she genuinely loved him. But as the conversation progressed, and she began insisting more aggressively while increasing the monetary value offered from 3,000 to 5,000 raise when he initially hesitated, something within him instinctively recognized that the situation was fundamentally wrong, even without being able to rationally articulate precisely why. The detective validated Lucas's expressed feelings with genuine professional empathy, stating that his confusion was completely understandable considering that an adult in a position of family trust had violated that trust by trying to manipulate him into participating in a criminal scheme, and especially praised the admirable courage demonstrated by recording evidence and subsequently revealing everything to his parents instead of remaining silent out of misguided family loyalty or fear of consequences, establishing that he had acted. After the formal interview with Lucas that lasted approximately 50 minutes, including pauses when the teenager needed to emotionally recompose himself, Detective Fernando requested to interview Paulo and me separately to obtain additional perspectives on family dynamics, and mainly the history of the relationship with Marta, that could provide context about whether the manipulative behavior documented in the video represented an aberrant, isolated incident or an established pattern of problematic conduct that had escalated. During my individual interview with the detective while Paulo remained with Lucas in the waiting room, I was asked to provide a detailed history of my relationship with my mother, including specific examples of previous manipulative behaviors that could establish a pattern relevant to the criminal investigation. And I found myself emotionally struggling to articulate decades of complex family dysfunction through a coherent narrative that the detective could understand without the extensive therapeutic context that normally. I explained to Detective Fernando with a voice heavy with barely contained emotion that my relationship with Marta had been characterized by repetitive cycles of sophisticated emotional manipulation throughout my adult life, including systematic attempts to undermine my confidence through subtle criticisms disguised as maternal concern, interference in my romantic relationships before marrying Paulo through insinuations about the inadequacy of chosen partners, and especially continued efforts to triangulate the relationship with Lucas creating. The detective listened attentively while taking meticulous notes, occasionally asking specific clarifying questions about concrete examples of manipulative behaviors that I vaguely described, forcing me to confront the reality that patterns I had unconsciously normalized for decades as merely difficult personality traits of my mother were actually manifestations of systematic emotional abuse that had progressively escalated until culminating in a criminal attempt to coerce my son. Detective Fernando specifically questioned whether Marta had made previous threats against me or the family before the incident documented on video, and I reported a series of veiled comments during previous months where she had repeatedly suggested that I was emotionally neglecting Lucas through excessive dedication to professional work, that the educational methods I employed were psychologically harmful based on inadequate modern theories, and especially that she should have more direct involvement in his upbringing. When Detective Fernando asked directly if I believed that Marta represented a continued threat to Lucas's emotional and physical safety if formal legal intervention was not established, I responded without hesitation that absolutely yes, considering that she had demonstrated criminal willingness to sacrifice the psychological well-being of a vulnerable adolescent to achieve destructive objectives directed against me, and especially that threatening messages received that morning, suggesting legal counterattack indicated escalation. Paulo provided a complimentary perspective during his separate interview with the detective, describing his observations as a family member who had witnessed interactions between Marta and our family during 14 years of marriage, confirming patterns of manipulative behavior that I had described, and mainly establishing that as a lawyer with experience in family cases, he recognized signs of a potentially dangerous personality that needed formal legal intervention to protect a vulnerable minor against manipulations. After completing all individual interviews and meticulously reviewing documentary evidence, including multiple reproductions of the recorded video and detailed analysis of exchanged WhatsApp messages, Detective Fernando convened a joint meeting with our family and Dr. Monica to communicate his preliminary assessment of the case and mainly outline the next procedural steps that would be followed during the formal criminal investigation he was officially initiating based on presented evidence. The detective declared with professional authority grounded in decades of investigative experience that the presented evidence clearly established the commission of serious crimes including corruption of a minor, as defined in the Brazilian Penal Code, attempted coercion to produce false testimony as specified in relevant criminal statutes, and mainly a pattern of psychological emotional abuse against a minor protected under the Child and Adolescent Statute, which establishes special protections for minors against exploitative adults. Detective Fernando explained that a formal investigation would be conducted, including summoning Marta to testify at the police station, responding to accusations documented in irrefutable video, forensic analysis of Lucas's mobile device to confirm authenticity of digital timestamps, and metadata, verifying that the recording was not altered or manipulated, and mainly consultation with a public prosecutor specialized in crimes against minors to determine if formal criminal charges would be judicially filed against. The news that a formal criminal investigation was being officially initiated against my biological mother provoked a complex, devastating mixture of relief because Lucas was being protected through appropriate state intervention, and simultaneously incalculable, profound sadness, recognizing the irreversibility of the family rupture that was being officialized through the criminal justice system that would permanently transform the mother-daughter relationship into a victim. Perpetrator dynamic documented in police and possibly public judicial records. Dr. Monica requested clarification about timelines involved, questioning when Marta would be summoned to testify, and mainly if temporary protective measures could be immediately established to prevent her contact with Lucas while the investigation was ongoing. And Detective Fernando confirmed that an emergency restraining order would be requested through an on-duty judge that same day, prohibiting Marta from contacting or approaching Lucas under penalty of immediate arrest. We left the police station approximately 3 hours after having arrived, emotionally exhausted, but relieved that authorities had taken the situation seriously, instead of minimizing it as merely a private family conflict as I had secretly feared might happen, and mainly reassured that Lucas was being treated appropriately as a victim needing protection, instead of a problematic accomplice in adult family drama that some insensitive professionals might have misinterpreted. Lucas remained silent during most of the car journey returning home, occasionally asking pointed questions about what would happen now that he had told everything to the police, revealing understandable anxiety about future consequences, and mainly persistent concern about his relationship with Marta, despite having been victimized by her cruel manipulation, demonstrating inevitable residual family loyalties that would have to be carefully processed through specialized therapy. The following week's agenda was intensively dedicated to establishing appropriate therapeutic support for Lucas, scheduling an initial evaluation with Dr. Helena, a psychiatrist specialized in childhood trauma who would conduct a comprehensive psychological assessment, documenting the emotional impact of the attempted coercion, and mainly developing an individualized treatment plan to help the adolescent process the devastating family betrayal and rebuild a sense of psychological safety that had been violated through the grandmother's manipulation. Lucas's first session with Dr. Helena occurred the following Tuesday in a psychiatrist's office comfortingly decorated with soft colors and welcoming furniture, specifically designed to reduce anxiety in young patients. And when he emerged after the hour of initial assessment, his facial expression revealed evident relief at finally having a safe, confidential space where he could process complex emotions without concern about protecting parental feelings or conflicting family loyalties. Dr. Helena requested a separate meeting with me and Paulo after the initial session with Lucas to discuss her preliminary clinical impressions and mainly recommend appropriate therapeutic approach, explaining that Lucas was presenting symptoms consistent with acute psychological trauma including elevated anxiety, difficulty sleeping, obsessive rumination about events in the park, and mainly intense feelings of misdirected guilt about consequences Marta would face, resulting from having revealed the manipulation. The psychiatrist emphasized that Lucas's guilt was a common reaction in minor victims of manipulation by adults in positions of family authority, where children internalized responsibility for negative consequences faced by perpetrators instead of recognizing that adults were exclusively responsible for their own criminal choices, and mainly that therapeutic work would focus extensively on helping the adolescent externalize guilt appropriately while reconstructing narratives about events that centralized. Dr. Helena recommended weekly individual therapy sessions for Lucas for at least 6 months initially, with periodic reassessments to adjust frequency according to therapeutic progress, and also strongly suggested that I consider my own therapy to process the trauma of having been the target of a criminal conspiracy by my biological mother, and mainly work through complex feelings about irreversible family rupture that had been necessary to protect my son. 2 weeks after filing the criminal complaint, we received formal notification via Dr. Monica that Marta had been summoned to testify at the police station and appeared accompanied by her own criminal attorney. Her testimony characterized by categorical denials of any bribery attempt, claiming that the conversation in the park had been misinterpreted by Lucas through adolescent immaturity, and mainly defensive accusations against me alleging that I was orchestrating systematic parental alienation. Marta's attempts to invert reality during official testimony were so transparently dishonest, considering irrefutable video evidence documenting explicit offering of 5,000 reais, linked to specific false accusations that Detective Fernando had reported to our lawyer with a tone of professional incredulity that he rarely witnessed such flagrant disconnection between a suspect's verbal denials and objective documentary evidence, suggesting that Marta either possessed disturbing psychological capacity. The public prosecutor specialized in crimes against minors reviewed the complete investigation conducted by Detective Fernando, including the recorded video, WhatsApp messages, testimonies of all involved parties, and mainly Lucas's psychological evaluation prepared by Dr. Helena, formally deciding to present criminal charges against Marta for corruption of a minor and attempted coercion to produce false testimony, crimes that carried potential prison sentences of 2 to 8 years. The news that my mother would be formally criminally charged and processed through the judicial system finally provoked the emotional collapse that had been repressed during weeks of legal procedures while maintaining composure for Lucas, manifesting through prolonged, uncontrollable crying, while Paulo held me, allowing decades of accumulated family pain to finally be released through cathartic emotional expression that had been postponed by the need to function practically during crisis. Paulo remained supportive throughout the entire process, offering unconditional emotional support, even while recognizing that he could not truly fully comprehend the devastating complexity of having to criminally prosecute one's own mother to protect a son. His constant presence and mainly willingness to take on additional practical responsibilities, while I processed the trauma, allowed me to gradually begin rebuilding emotional stability necessary to continue functioning as a present mother for Lucas. Teacher Regina from Lucas's school requested a meeting after being informed by the administration about the family situation in general terms without specific details, offering educational support including flexibility with schoolwork deadlines during the adjustment period, and mainly discreet monitoring of Lucas's emotional well-being during school hours to identify signs of distress that might require additional intervention coordinated with the therapeutic team. Lucas gradually began showing signs of emotional recovery through continued sessions with Dr. Helena, reporting reduction in recurring nightmares about the confrontation in the park, and primarily developing an increasing capacity to discuss events without experiencing paralyzing anxiety, confirming the effectiveness of appropriately implemented specialized therapeutic treatment and especially the remarkable resilience of adolescents when provided adequate support to process traumatic experiences. The criminal process against Marta progressed through the judicial system during subsequent months, including preliminary hearings where the judge reviewed evidence and determined that the case had sufficient merit to proceed to formal trial, each court appearance renewing emotional trauma while simultaneously validating that the justice system was taking crimes committed against Lucas seriously instead of minimizing them as a private family conflict. During one of the preliminary hearings, I had the opportunity to see Marta for the first time since discovering her scheme. Her physical appearance had visibly deteriorated with evident weight loss and a facial expression that alternated between poorly contained anger directed at me and dramatic performative self. Pity directed toward the judge, but notably a complete absence of demonstration of genuine remorse or acknowledgement of damages inflicted upon Lucas. Marta's defense attorney attempted the legal strategy of arguing that she had acted out of genuinely misguided concern about Lucas's well-being based on mistaken perceptions about my parenting capacity. But the public prosecutor effectively dismantled that narrative, pointing out that the specific monetary offer of 5,000 Rs linked to detailed false accusations documented on video was incompatible with claims of legitimate maternal concern and revealed criminal intent. Eventually, after 7 months of prolonged legal proceedings, Marta accepted a judicial agreement negotiated by lawyers avoiding a full trial, admitting reduced guilt for attempted coercion in exchange for a suspended sentence including 3 years of probation, mandatory community service, mandatory psychological therapy, and most importantly, a permanent restraining order prohibiting contact with Lucas until he reaches legal adulthood at 18 years. The judicial agreement, although not resulting in Marta's imprisonment, as Paulo had initially advocated, established tangible formal legal consequences and, most importantly, lasting legal protection for Lucas against future manipulations, allowing us to gradually begin rebuilding a sense of family normalcy, without the constant threat of her destructive interference hovering over the daily relationships we had carefully established over previous years. Lucas continued progressing therapeutically through dedicated work with Dr. Helena, developing a more mature understanding of dysfunctional family dynamics, and primarily internalizing the fundamental truth that he bore no responsibility for manipulative behaviors of adults, and that his brave choice to reveal manipulation instead of participating demonstrated admirable moral integrity that would positively define him during future years of development into a person of integrity. Did you like Carolina's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.